Hi, I'm Dr. Carrie Weaver, and today you are viewing the design, development, and deployment of academic integrity modules for students in STEM initial research findings. I am the Learning, Teaching, and Instructional Design Librarian at the University of Waterloo in Waterloo, Ontario. I use she, her pronouns, and my co presenters today include Amanda McKinsey, also she, her pronouns, who is the Director of Quality Assurance Academic Programs and Academic Integrity. And joining me on this recording, Dr. Karina Arambide, the user experience specialist at the University of Waterloo Library. So with that, we would like to take a moment to respectfully acknowledge that we live, work, and learn on the lands of the Haldeman Treaty of 1784, a formally ratified agreement promising the land in perpetuity to the Six Nations of the Grand River, and is within the territory traditionally cared for by the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. This acknowledgement is just a small step to challenge colonialism and honor the enduring presence, achievements, and contributions of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples here in Canada. Um, so today we have a little bit introductions and background. The objective of our user analysis, our questions and method, the findings, which Karina will be sharing with us, and the Q&A today, since unfortunately due to illness we weren't able to come to Indianapolis in person, will be through the conference app. So please feel free to leave your questions and we will keep an eye on those, and would be happy to interact with you in that way. So the project of creating modules for undergraduate STEM students on academic integrity started in December 2021 and January 2022 when the eCampus Ontario organization offered a significant group of funding for open educational resource projects. Over $50 million that was meant to help fund reusable and adaptable educational materials for students, primarily in Ontario, but then eventually across the world. At the University of Waterloo, the library and the Office of Academic Integrity had been working together for a couple of years and had just prior to this time completed a redesign of a required graduate level academic integrity course that those two units had worked on together uh, about 12 to 15 years prior, and had decided that it was time for a re-envisioning of that. After that successful project, it was recognized by the people who had worked on that project and also some others around the campus that there was a specific need in the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics areas for academic integrity content that was specific to those fields. And this was particularly thought of because when you looked at existing academic integrity content, or when we looked at the academic integrity content from that prior project, what we would often see is that some of the examples and so forth, for instance, in mathematics, um, would just be pulling from an example of students writing an essay or term paper, which isn't an assignment that students in the mathematics field typically participate in. So our goal in this was to really look at how we could create these open educational resources that could be used, that would have examples and content that would be really applicable to those STEM fields instead of just rehashing um, examples that were really successful in the humanities or social science, but maybe didn't have as much impact in those STEM fields. So, out of the project, though the University of Waterloo led the project, there were 11 collaborating institutions across Ontario who signed on to the project, planning to eventually take the designed modules and content once the project was completed in February 2022 and adapt them for use at their own institutions. So, the project team in developing the modules followed a standard instructional design process in 5 parts. So, it started by actually talking to students and determining what do students know and need when they're entering the university, specifically STEM students, about academic integrity. And this was done in collaboration with the Student Success Office at the University of Waterloo, who helped conduct focus groups across the 4 main content areas that we wanted to cover within the modules, which were science, mathematics, computer science, and engineering, which follow with some of our main academic programs, but also that were of interest to those collaborating institutions. After we determined what the learners actually needed and what they knew already about academic integrity, we moved on to a content development process. And this included representation from the Office of Academic Integrity, the Student Success Office, and the library. And then we got additional feedback on the content through an iterative process from some of our collaborating institutions and from other stakeholders like academic deans and some faculty in the STEM disciplines we were hoping to cover. After we had the content established that we wished to cover within the modules, we moved on to storyboarding to connect the different design elements that we were considering or working on to the content itself. And then once we had established that storyboard, that overall roadmap for what we were going to design, we moved on to the full design, testing, and accessibility compliance step. After we did this, then we did some initial assessment and iteration where we asked a number of students to give us some direct feedback, work through the modules, and tell us any pain points. But we certainly had hoped throughout this design process to be able to take it forward in the future and think in a little bit more of a fulsome way about the actual impact of the content for students. And our initial assessment and iteration really gave us a lot of information about the functionality and some of the initial design choices and interactivity choices that we had made for the modules. So out of the project, we were able to create 6 open reusable modules on the topics of understanding the fundamental values of academic integrity, obtaining help in using aids, collaboration and sharing materials, which was one of the points that was particularly desired by STEM students for us to cover because they do so much group and lab based work within STEM fields. And they often weren't sure where the line was as to what was acceptable for academic integrity or academic misconduct. Working with information and citing your sources, and finally, strategies for acting with integrity, which is consistent with how at the University of Waterloo and across many of the collaborating institutions in Ontario, we're trying to draw the connection for students between acting with integrity in the academic environment and acting with integrity in other places in life, it's particularly important that we addressed it here because we have very large cooperative education programs at the University of Waterloo. And so students are bouncing back and forth between work lives and academic lives already while they are at our institution. So the 6 open reusable modules will be linked below the YouTube video and are linked in this presentation, but we would invite all of you to take a look at what has been created. We're very proud of what we came up with. And I would like to also mention that as part of the project, we came up with these 6 modules. The 6 modules are also available in French, but given that we know that we're presenting here at a US-based conference, those may be less useful to some of you who are viewing this presentation today. But they are available in French and can be found near the in the repository near where we have the modules. So we were successful in creating the modules, but we still had this question outstanding about how effective are the modules at introducing and educating STEM undergraduates on academic integrity concepts. And for that, we wanted to do some additional work. And so we invited Karina, who you will hear from in just a minute or two, to collaborate with us, as her expertise is really in understanding the user experience. So in October 2022, we collaborated to have 7 focus groups. Those were conducted online with 47 participants so that we could uncover and understand students' experience in relation to the modules in a much more in-depth sense than we had been able to during the initial assessment and iteration phase. And the questions that we asked the students in the focus groups were really oriented around these 3 research questions. What are the needs and preferences of STEM undergraduate students when reviewing content related to academic integrity? What are the pain points, issues, and knowledge gaps within the current modules? And how can modules be improved based on students' feedback? So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Karina, who will talk a little bit about the findings of these focus groups and what we found out from STEM students in relation to those research questions. Karina?
Thank you, Carrie. So I will discuss a little bit of some of the findings that based on students' feedback from these focus groups. So after we collected all the feedback, we coded the responses from the students, and we came up with several themes that encompass some of the main pain points or knowledge gap that students mention when reviewing the academic integrity modules. So our first theme talks about the overall content, how the information is helpful for the students, how the content is divided by faculty or department, how the contents also provide useful feedback to students in relation to understand what are the main knowledge gaps there. And also students highlighted the use of realistic examples within the modules. So when students were talking about the content, they found that the material was valuable and engaging. And they also mentioned that this information is important because academic integrity is a fundamental facet of the institution. So some of the attributes they emphasize about these modules is the ease of use and how easy it was to understand the information. As I mentioned, one of the things that they highlighted is that the content and the examples are divided by faculty or department. They mentioned that this information facilitates them to understand the context of a situation and how to address potential misconduct. And they also mentioned that this information is useful for students that are taking elective courses and they need to understand different scenarios based on the faculty or the department. In terms of the realistic examples, students mentioned that having this variety of examples is particularly helpful, especially for those students that might not be familiar with the academic integrity content, or maybe they are first-year students and they are not familiar with academic integrity guidelines. Um, the participants also emphasize having realistic scenarios applied to distinct faculties or department because this is valuable to pinpoint topics for specific programs. So one of the things they mentioned is that when collaborating with other students, maybe there's a difference between faculties or departments for lab reports. So it was really useful for them to have that information, so they can draw the line when the collaboration is needed, and one collaboration could be considered potential misconduct. The modules also provided students with check your knowledge activities. And the students mentioned that they appreciated having these tests or quizzes to ensure that they are understanding the content. And this also helps them to summarize the information. And at the same time, students mentioned that these check your knowledge activities gave them the opportunity to validate their answers, and that these activities provided information and feedback in case they chose the wrong answer. The activities would give them the right answer and an explanation of why this information was helpful. So the students mentioned that these activities help them prevent knowledge gaps in their understanding. Um, For the next theme, students talked about information organization and flow. So when talking about how the information is organized in the modules, students mentioned that the modules are well organized and information is easy to digest and understand. One example that they highlighted was the use of bullet points as a simpler way to follow and comprehend the content. When talking about how the information flows between the modules, participants also mentioned that each module can be reviewed individually and the content will remain coherent. And participants also highlighted that it is useful to have a brief introduction and the learning outcomes for each module because it helps them to understand the information. When participants talk about the interactive component of the modules, they highlighted that this is a useful feature because the information is divided into more digestible and interactive sections. So these interactive sections keep the users engaged. For the next theme, we talked about how the modules could be considered mandatory and if students would recommend the content to other STEM students. So students mentioned the importance and the benefit of this module. They mentioned that this information is relevant and every student should be familiar with the content. They also mentioned that they would like to see these modules and the information as part of a course grade or maybe as a mandatory requirement, especially for first-year students that may not be aware of this information. Students also mentioned that they would recommend these modules to other STEM students because this information is presented in a concise and easy to comprehend way. And again, they highlighted the importance of having this information readily available, and that understanding and learning about academic misconduct is important. When talking about the visual aspects and branding of these modules, participants talked about the use of visual elements and colors. They like the graphics and the avatars, and students also mentioned that they like the visuals because they make the content more relatable for them, especially for students that are considered visual learners. They also mentioned that it is easier to comprehend and engage with with the information when there is a visual aspect connected to the content. And they also highlighted that visuals improve interactivity. When participants mentioned the branding, they welcome having the Waterloo branding integrated to the modules because they feel the content looks more official and reliable. Participants also talk in the next theme about possible changes and improvements to the modules. So they mentioned the following changes or updates to the modules. They mentioned that some content can be summarized to be more concise, and instead of having large pages with text, we should consider implemented slides with smaller segments to keep students engaged. And even though we do have bullet points, maybe some of the content can be summarized so students are engaged with the content. Students also mentioned that maybe integrating some other types of check your knowledge activities could be beneficial to keep students engaged. So for example, some of the suggestions talked about implementing gamification elements to improve the understanding of learning objectives and keep students engaged. Another thing that students mention about improvements is including more information about how to use resources that the university is providing. So for example, how to use university databases or how to contact librarians that can help with some questions about academic integrity. And another thing that they also highlighted is that they would like to see more personalized or scenario-specific examples. So some participants mentioned that various examples could be very similar, so they would like to see more varied examples about different departments or faculties. So for the discussion and the recommendations and next steps for these modules, so overall, participants mentioned the usefulness and advantage of these modules to understand and learn about academic integrity. So they highlighted that the information is clear, concise, and easy to understand. One of the main factors that they highlighted is the interactivity when reviewing the content, and that providing different ways to review and validate knowledge is important to participants. So integrating other types of media, such as video or audios, maybe could increase engagement and learnability. And an important improvement that should be taken into account, again, is the implementation of more application-based examples. So participants mentioned that having these realistic examples will help them to pinpoint scenarios that can be susceptible to academic misconduct. So this information is important, and this information would help them to avoid academic misconduct and should be emphasized within the modules. So for future work, our plan is to review these improvements and these suggestions based on students' feedback and prioritize changes that should be implemented within the modules. A future user study could investigate how these improvements impact students' experience, and our objective for future research is to validate the current findings and increase student knowledge about academic integrity and improve their experience. Thank you, Carrie. I will now move back to you.
Thank you so much, Karina, for giving us an overview of the focus group findings. So as we are doing this online, as I mentioned, if you could please share your questions with us through the conference app, and we will be monitoring and responding to those there. Thank you so much for your time and attention, and we hope that you take the opportunity of the additional time in this conference session to take a look at what we've built and some of what we found and think about. Um, what you might do if you were adopting these modules at your institution. And with that, thank you so much. You have a wonderful Saturday.